The trade war causes a lot of anxiety. Every day we listen to a new statement by Trump and it gets us all excited. But that's him. What we're in fact seeing is a long trial of strength between China and the US. China's economy in real terms has already overtaken the US, and in nominal terms will become much larger than the US, simply because China's population is 4 times the size of the US, and the Chinese are hardworking people and high savers and give a lot of attention to education and the acquisition of knowledge. But the US has been dominant for so many decades. The idea that another power will overtake it economically is very difficult for the US and to some extent the entire West to accept. So there is a tension, a struggle. We are in the great transition to a multipolar world. China is not going to dominate the world, and China doesn't want to replace the US as global hegemon. China has enough problems of its own to worry about. So this period will be one where from time to time the US will be testing China. And if China shows any weakness, you can be sure that the US will go for the weakness. So China's policy is to be prepared as far as it can for all eventuality. But however well prepared you are, there are always things that you don't anticipate and which will catch you by surprise. Now, this trade war, this tariff war, is a trial of strength. The US wants China to come begging. China says, I won't beg. If you want to fight, we'll fight. How long? But China's view is, we don't want to escalate. We prefer to talk. But there must be mutual respect, and it must be on the basis of equality. Trump wants to win, but China doesn't want to be bullied. China doesn't want to win. China wants it to be win-win, not win-lose. And because of that, I think there will be negotiations. And Trump needs it because his preoccupation is domestic. By the end of next year, the US will have the midterm elections. And if the Republicans lose control of either the Senate or the House, it will be difficult for Trump to pass legislation, which means that the second half of his administration may be a write-off. So by the middle of next year, the primary elections, the campaigning will begin, which means that Trump has 1 year to convince his supporters that he is succeeding in making America great again. But to do that, he's got to solve many problems. He's got to cut the deficit. He's got to ensure that the US becomes more competitive, which means lowering the value of the US dollar, but at the same time maintaining its position as a global reserve currency. He wants the borders to be better controlled. He wants the US to recover its manufacturing capability. He wants many things. It's not easy, and he may not succeed. And if he can get even 40 bucks out of 100, he will be very successful. To do all this, he needs a stable external environment, and he needs the cooperation of China. Of course, he would prefer to bully China into cooperation so that China will give him everything he wants. But China will not accept that. China's position is, no, let's talk, and let's find ways to help each other. And that's what China wants. You can bully Panama, and Panama has no choice. But you can't bully Europe, you can't bully Canada fully, and the Canadians show that they've got some teeth also. You may be able to bully Japan, you think, but Japan holds $1 trillion worth of treasury bonds. And when the Japanese say, we will not make use of that, they are in fact saying, please don't forget that. It's part of negotiations. So think about this. Let's say we have an agreement. Does this mean that the tension between the US and China has gone away? No, something else will happen. So it's better that the trial of strength is on tariffs and trade than it is over Taiwan or the South China Sea or over the East China Sea or over the Korean Peninsula. At least people won't die from a tariff war. So in a sense, it's not a bad thing that this trial of strength is happening because it will show to the Americans that you can't just push China around. And if the US respects China and deals with China on the basis of equality, many problems in the world can be ameliorated. It's good for the world. No other country in the world had to go through so many obstacles to join the WTO as China. Even though China was a much smaller economy at that time, it showed that it was becoming very competitive. And the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese, and others all wanted to safeguard their own interests. So they extracted concessions from China. And I dealt with Shi Guangsheng, I dealt with Long Yong-tu, China's Commerce Minister, China's trade negotiator at that time. And I knew how hard they had to negotiate to enter the WTO. They were exhausted. Chinese officials asked us in Singapore, I was trade minister at the time, they said, can we not have to negotiate with Singapore? I said, it's okay, we don't have to negotiate with us. Because all of Singapore's needs were already met by other countries' negotiations. This is the most favored nation principle, that whatever you give to one country must be given to every other member of the WTO. So we said, you have a pass. I did not worry that Singapore would be shortchanged, and I knew this would help China. And I think there was some gratitude for that. And I observed from the side some of the negotiations which were taking place. A few years later, Singapore helped to form the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I spoke to Shi Guangsheng, the Commerce Minister. I said, why don't China join the TPP? He put his hands up. He said, no, we have already given up so much to join the WTO. At that time, Premier Zhu Rongji was a very decisive man. He said, the disciplines of the WTO is good for China, especially for the state-owned enterprises. And even though it was painful, even though it was difficult, persist. And every week, Long Yong-tu appeared on national television to explain the WTO to ordinary Chinese citizens. Now, I remarked to some of my friends in Europe and America. I say, no other population has more knowledge of the WTO than China, because Long Yong-tu kept on going on national television and explaining what it meant to Chinese companies and Chinese individuals. China grew. Between accession to the WTO in November 2011 and the beginning of COVID at the end of 2019, China's economy in PPP terms grew 7 times. In renminbi terms, grew 9 times. In US dollar terms, grew 11 times. No one expected that China will continue to maintain this steady growth. Not China itself, certainly not the US. So now, when the US sees China suddenly becoming so big, they said, why should we agree to China being a developing country? And this is now the tension at WTO. The US has decided it's no longer fair. So they want to get out from the WTO. They're trying to create an alternative global trading system. And this is very disruptive. But this is the world we're entering. It creates a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety for countries, for business people, but we have to live with it. China now accounts for maybe close to a third of global manufacturing. And if you look at tradable manufacturing, maybe 40%, maybe more. But if it continues, China could be close to half of global manufacturing. And this is not sustainable. The reason is this. You take America. American power is based on the US Navy. America is an island, and it dominates the world by sea power. They inherited this position from the British, who created the empire using sea power. So they were very good at building ships. Today, 80% of ships by tonnage is built in China. So if you are in the Pentagon, you will say this is very dangerous. How can American power be sustained if we can't build ships? And if our drones are much more expensive and less capable than Chinese drones? And Boeing has difficulties, as we know. So there is a very genuine worry that the hollowing out of manufacturing in America has national security implications. So we must expect that in countries that have lost manufacturing, that they will want some of it back. And they will target China. Now in Southeast Asia, we threaten nobody. We are friendly to all powers. We are no threat to China, we are no threat to America, we are no threat to Japan. So we are nice people. And because of that, they say, well, okay, then we manufacture in Southeast Asia. So to some extent, trade tensions between US and China benefit Southeast Asia, because a lot of investments have come in, not just by Western companies and Japanese companies, but also by Chinese companies who are now manufacturing in Southeast Asia, and their owners may have become Thai or Malaysian or Indonesian or Singaporean, and now they export to the world as Southeast Asians, and they cannot be stopped. It's a little like the fashion industry. There's a big Vento community in Italy, outside Florence. They're making fashion products, handbags, neckties, and so on. And it says made in Italy. Well, actually made by Vento in Italy. It could be made by Dongguan in Thailand or whatever. Of course, you don't write that. But when you have these tensions, the market will adjust, people will adjust, and trade will find its own way. So we've got to live with a world that will become messier, less predictable, and the important thing for all of us, whether we're in Southeast Asia or in China or America, is prepare for uncertainty. Take smaller steps. Don't take too much risk, and build smaller structures. Then if there's an earthquake, it's okay, you can readjust. You can re-level your buildings. But if you take a big step, you build a big structure, and the earth moves, then you're in trouble. So this is the period we're entering in, where the future is more and more uncertain. So it's better to diversify risks, take a shorter term point of view without losing a sense of direction, and take smaller steps. The governance of Singapore requires a balance between keeping the people united and being responsive to changes in the external environment. Sometimes the external environment changes so rapidly, we are forced to make internal changes which are not always easy, for local people to accept. So government has to explain why certain decisions are taken and to help those who are disadvantaged by the changes that have been introduced. So this is a constant challenge. The world is changing rapidly. We're in a great transition to a multipolar world, and all this has an impact on Singapore. The cost of living has gone up. The government is trying very hard to make sure that no one is left behind. But at the same time, we have to open ourselves to the world, welcome the inflow of capital, family offices, investments, and so on, and stay relevant. And in this period when China-US relations are tense, maintain a dynamic balance so that we continue to maintain our relationships with all the major economic powers in the world. So Singapore is always a balancing act. And the response of Singaporeans to the new leadership under Lawrence Wong, I think is very heartening. The popular vote has gone up 5%, and that's very significant. And the PAP, the ruling party, now commands the support of close to 2/3 of the population. That is a high achievement. And this bodes well for us. It means that we're united, and this unity will be a great asset when we face external challenges. The current mood in the West is emotional. To some extent, they have lost a sense of history. They become ideological. And they are unable to understand China in its own terms. When Western journalists come to China, many of them, instead of seeking to understand China, and China is big, it's complicated, and you have to be humble, to ask questions, to learn. Many of them, instead, when they come, they spend a month, they interview people, they visit a few factories, they go back, they write a long article, they give an interview. They become a China expert. I read these reports, I said, it's amazing. You know, there's a saying in English, physician, heal yourself. If it's so easy to govern China, why don't you help your own country govern, your own governments govern your own country? It should be much easier, since you know these countries better. Politics is not a simple matter, but the Western journalists are used to being dominant for so long. When they visit Singapore, Japan, or China, they're all the time judging. It's not good, because if you're judging, you're not analyzing. You should study. I remember what Mao Zedong once said, no social investigation, no right to speak. First, know the reality. Then you have a right to speak. And understanding the Chinese reality means understanding not only today's China, but understanding China's culture and history, and why the Chinese civilization has endured so long, and why the Chinese people are so homogeneous, much more than any other people on earth. What's the reason for this? And it creates a pattern very different from the West. But the West has been dominant in our lives. Sometimes it's difficult for us to jump outside the Western framework. So when I go to a Chinese university, they talk about neoliberalism, post-liberalism, and so on. I tell myself, these are all Western intellectual categories, and they do not explain China very well. So in the end, China will have to explain itself and hope that the West will slowly respect that this is a different civilization. But there's a good example. In the 16th century, when the Western missionaries came, like the Jesuits, 耶稣会, 利玛窦 and the others, what did they do? They studied the Chinese language. They studied the 色书五经. They had to understand Chinese culture, how to write Chinese. Then they had to talk to the scholars, to the Mandarins. Then they said, okay, this is how I will persuade Chinese intellectuals of my religion. First, I understand you, I respect you, and I use your philosophical categories. No, the word for God in Christianity, Deus in Latin, there's no easy translation in Chinese. So when they came, they didn't know how to translate God into Chinese. So Li Ma-tou, he was a very brilliant man. He said, the emperor is Tianzi. He governs Tianxia, but everything is below Tian. So if you do not conform to Tian, to Tianming, then you have Geming. He says God is Tianzu. And that's how Li Ma-tou translates God into Chinese, Tianzu. And till today, the Catholic religion is called Tianzu Jiao. So this translation involves respect and understanding before you make a recommendation. It required a lifetime of study. And I hope that a new generation of Western scholars and intellectuals will spend time to re-understand China in its history and contemporary China in order to help manage Western relations with China. The West must understand China, and China must also understand the West. It's very common now as China becomes more confident, more self-confident, for Chinese people to be very critical of the Western system. I told them it's not wise. Always be humble and always try to understand the West against its own history. Do not be guilty of the same thing you criticize the West when they look at China. Because the European history is fascinating. It's very rich. And Europe probably contributed more to world history than China did. So understand the West, then it'll be a beautiful world. So this multipolar world that we talk about requires effort for it to be peaceful, requires understanding, requires humility, requires restraint. China will be an important part of this new world, and it should not be overconfident. But it will be a multipolar world. The shape is not very clear, but China will be one big pole. Russia will be a pole on itself. Europe will be a kind of a loose pole. India will be a smaller pole. So too Brazil. Of course, America will remain a very big pole. In the multipolar world, the dynamics of politics, of economics, of military affairs is much more complicated. It will be like China during Zhongqiu Zhanguo. Many states constantly allying, fighting each other. So this new world we're talking about is not necessarily a peaceful world, but it'll be a multipolar world. It'll be more complicated. When you have two poles, it is more stable. When you have many poles, it's dynamic and very interesting. And maybe for small countries like Singapore, we may have more room in a multipolar world, but there's no certainty. So BRICS is a necessary counterpoise to the G7. You know, during the global financial crisis, the G7 could not generate sufficient global demand. So Bush Jr. convened the first G20 summit in 2008. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown convened the second in London. And the G20 countries coordinated fiscal and monetary policy. And China instituted a 4 trillion renminbi budget. So China helped the world shorten the period of recession during the global financial crisis. It created huge distortions in the Chinese economy. There was one report which said that in 3 years, China bought more concrete in China than America in its entire history. This was how much China was spending. It created demand which helped the world. Today, if there's a financial crisis, there's no G20 because the G7 doesn't want to deal with Russia. And the G7 is too small to save the world in the global financial crisis. That is why the US knows that it will have to work with China. They may not like it, but there may be no choice. And China should understand this, that you are not asking the US to like you, but you're asking the US to work with you on a reciprocal win-win basis. And BRICS is part of this dynamic.